When I woke up, very confused, she said, "You almost died last night. In fact, no one can believe you were alive."
I went into the games not knowing what was coming.
As humans, we just hate uncertainty.
You just sensed that it was out there.
You have to start somewhere.
We're all programmed to push ourselves even farther.
This is On the X, an Ironclad original. Welcome to On the X. My guest today is Admiral Bill McRaven, one of the most respected military leaders of his generation. Over a 37-year career as a Navy SEAL, he eventually became the 9th commander of the U.S. Special Operations Command. He's perhaps best known for organizing and overseeing Operation Neptune Spear, the mission that brought down Osama bin Laden in 2011. After retiring from active duty, Admiral McRaven continued his public service as Chancellor of the University of Texas System, and went on to become a best-selling author of several books, including Make Your Bed, Sea Stories, The Hero Code, The Wisdom of the Bullfrog, and now his newest, Conquering Crisis. His latest book draws on decades of battlefield leadership and real-world adversity to offer a guide for navigating life's most difficult moments. It's a call to meet crisis with clarity, character, and courage, and that's where we focus our conversation today. So here we go with Admiral McRaven on the X. Well, let's get into it. So thanks for sending me your book. It only came out 2 days ago, and so your team sent me an advanced copy, which I got through. Conquering Crisis: 10 Lessons to Learn Before You Need Them. So why now? What brought this about for you?
Yeah, so you don't write a book based on the times. I mean, I worked on this book for, off and on for about a year. And the point, as you can all appreciate, Chris, is, when you think about crisis leadership, it's kind of fundamentally different than day-to-day leadership. Now, at the end of the day, you still need to apply the basic, talents and rules that you use in day-to-day leadership. You got to be a person of character and integrity. You got to work hard. You got to take care of the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, all that sort of stuff. But crisis leadership brings with it a whole nother set of problems. Normally, you have time constraints, you have resource constraints, people's lives are on the line, you have reputational risk, and then people are watching. So all of that means you need a different set of tools. And so this book was, if you go back and you look at The Wisdom of the Bullfrog, that really was, okay, maybe not Leadership 101, but, from the, from your to maybe your master's degree. But then this one was, hey, let's take another step further and let's talk about some really difficult situations where, these new tool sets will come in handy to you.
Yeah. So how would you define a crisis then? Because when I was reading through it, there is a lot of stuff in here which just kind of, I think, works in a day-to-day, that type of thing. So for kind of, obviously the stuff you're drawing on here is personal experience for you. And look, what I loved about it too is most of it is things that didn't go well. There's not a lot of like, hey, I was really killing it here. It's more just like, yeah, this didn't go well, or this was a big mistake. And then you have your kind of personal circumstances, and you're tying in all these things that people that are my age certainly would remember from, Iran-Contra affair all the way back to the Punic Wars. So you're spanning 2,200 years here. So like for things that fall outside that realm, like we're not talking about national security for most people. We're not talking about even probably a military circumstance, but like people that are just day-to-day Americans in business, what constitutes crisis? Where does that flip happen, so to speak, you think?
Yeah, so it's a great question because, when I wrote the book, I started off thinking about it in terms of a bit of a business book. This was going to be for CEOs, military leaders, university leaders, people that are running kind of large organizations. But as I began to write it, I realized that, hey, look, these are skill sets that are transferable down to you as an individual, you as the leader of your family or whatever, it might be. And so, when you think about a crisis, that can vary. Somebody's crisis to me is like, that's kind of day to day. When you spend your time in the special operations community, you do look at crises a little different. From our time in Iraq and Afghanistan, most people would say every day was a crisis, but in reality, it's what we did, right? But the crisis generally is something that is kind of unforeseen and unplanned for, that maybe you haven't built a plan to deal with it. Now, again, I talk about Apollo 13 as the lead into this. So here you have Apollo 13. It's April 13th, 1970. These guys are three of the most experienced astronauts in the NASA program. They're on their way to the moon. And the next thing you know, O2 tank blows up in the command module, and now everything that they'd planned is out the window, right? And so when you think about a crisis, again, lives are on the line. NASA's reputation's on the line. The time is of the essence because they have to move from the command module to the lunar module, which is not designed for 3 guys. They're running out of oxygen. They're freezing, So all of these things begin to take place. Well, when you think about it on a personal level, there's a little bit of the same thing. You didn't plan to pick something. You've got an illness. One of your children has got problems, something that you didn't really think about. Now, how do you deal with it? Well, the first thing I tell people is you got to deal with it head on. I laughingly talk about the second law of thermodynamics.
Right.
So I teach a class at the University of Texas LBJ school, and I start talking about this. I said, okay, some of you folks out there, I know we got some engineers out there. Tell me what the second law of thermodynamics is. And of course, most of them are like, I don't have a clue. And of course,
I know, which is so sad when you mentioned that and they didn't know. I'm like, oh, come on, guys.
It's a little bit of a teaser, though, And of course, the second law of thermodynamics in engineering terms has to do with a closed system and the fact that matter will continue to maximum entropy, meaning things are going to continue to deteriorate, right? So my point, the analogy of the second law of thermodynamics is if you do nothing, the crisis is not going to get better.
Yeah.
That's just a fundamental law of physics, and I would say a fundamental law of crises is they get worse. So sometimes when you have a personal crisis in your life, you're like, man, I'm hoping this is going to get better. Well, hope is not a strategy. Hoping's not going to get you there. You got to confront it. If it's something you've done, you better stand up. You better recognize that you were responsible for this, and you better figure out a way to again, make amends to whoever your friends are, or figure out how you're going to deal with your children, your personal life, your business, but don't avoid it. And this is kind of one of the key things. You got to face it head on, and you got to kind of face it personally. If it's a crisis of your own making, you better look in the mirror and say, you know what? I screwed up. I made a mistake, and now I got to do what it takes to fix this.
Yeah. So before we get into those 10 points, because that is one of the points about the second law of thermodynamics, just a couple more framing this up for people. First of all, just out of curiosity, the whole Apollo 13 thing, you sort of mentioned too at the end, like that was kind of a formative thing for you as a kid watching that. Did this content, did you look at that and extrapolate those lessons from that, or was it more you had extrapolated them from obviously your career and everything you've done, and then you looked at that example to think, that's a place where it was done kind of perfectly across all of these points?
Yeah, it's a good question, Chris. Probably a little bit of both.
Yeah.
I mean, same thing. When I wrote the Hero Code a couple of books back, I started writing and I thought, well, I'm not sure I know what a hero is.
Yeah, sure.
I know what I think a hero is. And so I'm struggling. You can see my library behind me. I'm saying, I got to figure out what a hero is. And I thought, well, maybe you ought to ask the dictionary, And so I went to the dictionary, and the dictionary said that a hero is someone we admire for our noble qualities. So I had the same sort of issue with a crisis. Okay, again, your crisis and my crisis may be different than other people's crisis, but what is the framework of a crisis? And of course, immediately I started thinking about Apollo 13. Now, part of it was I had met Captain Jim Lovell a couple of years ago in Houston, and you can't think about growing up in my time, I was in high school at the time when Apollo 13 happened, and of course Jim Lovell was an icon, and then Tom Hanks makes the movie, Houston, we have a problem. But at the same time, so I'm working in parallel. I'm thinking, okay, I need to define what a crisis is. I know the crises I've had in my career and in my life.
Right.
What's one that really kind of frames the idea of a crisis? And, oh, by the way, frames the way to get out of it. So when you think of Apollo 13, it was the worst possible crisis in terms of the nation, but we also got out of it. So I drew from those lessons and then began to extrapolate those into, okay, now let me tell some personal stories and either how I got out of these crises or how I screwed them up even further.
Right. It's your reverence for Jim Lovell comes through very loud and clear in your writing in this. And it just made me think that movie came out when I was a midshipman at the Naval Academy, and they did a premiere in the whatever field, whatever the kind of basketball arena there. I can't even remember what it's called at this point, but and he came to it. So he was at the premiere in there. So it was pretty cool. And I don't even know,
when I met him, he was in his late 80s.
Yeah.
sharp as a tack. And of course, he's still alive. He's still doing well.
Is he? I didn't know that.
Yeah. In fact, I reached out to the pastor who had introduced me to him to find out, hey, is Jim Lovell still doing okay? And he goes, yeah, I don't know what he is now, 90 some odd years old.
Yeah.
Still doing quite well.
Awesome.
So space didn't hurt him too much.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So cool. So then there's this other kind of, you've got these 10 lessons, but there's this kind of phases to resolve a crisis that you've got in here, right? So assess, report, contain, shape, manage. And you've got a kind of a little wheel at the beginning of each chapter where it sort of talks about that. So just kind of frame that up for people. And by the way, is that your construct or is that an existing, that's your construct?
Yeah, it's my construct. And interestingly enough, my son, Bill, who was a major in the Air Force, I talk to my kids sometimes when I'm writing these things, and I was trying to figure out, again, how to frame not only the individual 10 points, but a little bit of framework. And Bill said, hey, Dad, when you wrote Spec Ops, when I did my graduate thesis, I had a framework for thinking about, special operations. And he said, you need to go back and kind of think about that sort of framework.
Yeah.
And so when I constructed this idea of, look, you've got the magnitude of the problem you got over time. And what are I did have to pull on my own experience. What are the phases I have to go through? And again, we all know that the first thing you have to do is you got to assess the problem. Maybe it's a crisis, maybe it isn't a crisis. And as you know, from, your time overseas, and so many times as a commander, the first reports are always wrong. So, I can't think of how many times from the field somebody calls up and says, hey, sir, everything's great. Oh, that's good. Glad to know that, And let me tell you, my antenna always go up, and then within an hour, it's, well, we got a little problem brewing here, and then within a couple hours, it's a major brouhaha. So, you have to be able to assess it, and again, assess it honestly. Then I talk about the assessing, then the reporting. And of course, the most important thing to do in a crisis is you got to contain it initially. And, to me, it's, I'm not sure I make the analogy in the book, but I think of a crisis like a fast-moving forest fire. And, if you think of a forest fire, the firefighters, the first thing they have to do is, where is the greatest point of threat? And you don't go into a forest fire and just decide you're going to dump a bucket of water on it. Now, you're going to bring everything you've got. You're going to bring all the firefighters. You're going to bring all the water planes. You're going to bring everything to slow the momentum to contain the fire or to contain the crisis. And then you can begin to kind of shape it a little bit to hopefully your outcome. And then sometimes, as with, we started off talking about COVID, and then as with COVID, sometimes it goes on for a long time, and you got to manage the crisis over time. Mm-hmm. Containing it really is probably the most important first step.
Got it. So then let's kind of go through these. And so you sort of mentioned that the first reports are always wrong in this, which I think it's funny when that came up as kind of the first thing in the book. I think of like the news cycle these days, because this is a real problem. I think even outside of like people's, like a crisis that would happen in business, is because our news cycle is so fast and they're trying to get the scoop and the first story. It happens all the time where the first thing you hear about whatever it is wrong, and people latch on to it too. So what do we do about that? Like, how do we?
Yeah. So it's not, I was on the CBS morning show here recently with Gail King and her crew, and I hadn't really thought about the news cycle, and she brings it up. And she says, that happens in the newsroom every day. And one of the things I point out in the book is, as the leader in a crisis like that, when the first reports come in, you have to be careful about making a declarative statement. And that's the caution. And of course, the hard part is there are people saying, well, you got to move on this. This is a crisis. We got to move quickly.
Yeah.
And you've got to find that balance between, okay, I recognize that I have to move quickly, but I also have to be smart enough and sophisticated enough to know I don't have all the facts. And I'm not going to come out and say, hey, we have put out the fire, or we have, we've got Saddam Hussein, or we've got bin Laden, or we pick something. You got to be very careful until you can kind of confirm everything as best you can. So the challenge is always, how do I confirm what I know? And how do I be careful about making a declarative statement when, if you're the CEO of a global organization, people want you to make a declarative statement. Well, this is what we're doing. This is what we know. You see a lot of times people come out and they're smart enough now to say, we don't have all the facts, but here's what we're doing. And I think that's the appropriate way to play it. Certainly for the media, be cautious at first. Say, look, this is preliminary reporting. We don't have all the facts. Here's what we know, and here's what we think is happening.
Yeah. Yeah. And you, you talk, I mean, when you talk about Battle of the Bulge in that chapter, but then you're also talking about this kind of Chilean exercise you're doing as a JO. And for me, it was like, oh, I remember stuff like this. Like
we've all had those moments, Chris, believe me.
Back in the day. Yeah. Okay. So second thing, have a council of colonels.
Right.
So, and you specifically in this, you're talking about being in Afghanistan, essentially getting an earful from the ambassador where you had to go back and go, hey, we need kind of like a little internal task force to assess what's going on. So talk a little bit about that. And I also want your input on, this makes me think of somebody like Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, of not necessarily, right, but being surrounded by creating a council, chamber, whatever, cabinet that disagrees with you in a lot of things to get you kind of right. Are those kind of the same thing in your mind, or are those different?
Yeah, no, same thing.
Okay.
So when I was a senior commander, I just left command of actually I guess SEAL Team 3, and then I was chief of staff at Group 1 for a little while. Then I got called down to SOCOM. The last place I wanted to go was to the SOCOM staff, and this was 1998, I believe. Mm-hmm. And they made me an assessment director. Now, an assessment director on the SOCOM staff were the group of colonels and Navy captains that were, at the time, not promotable. So, it's like, oh, great, I'm going to be an assessment director. Maybe this is the end of my career. But Wayne Downing, General Wayne Downing, who had been one of the great SOCOM commanders, had established the assessment directors to review all of the programs coming to SOCOM. And the reason he made them unpromotable or hired them because they were unpromotable is because he knew that they wouldn't be brown-nosing him. They would, oh, yes,
right.
This is the important thing in the world. Sure, I'll say the right thing, so maybe I'll get promoted. So this was the idea of the Council of Colonels, was you would have, there were 5 of us, and they were all Army and Air Force, and I was the one Navy guy. And the idea was we would speak truth to power. We were going to tell, and if time I was there, it was General Pete Schoonmaker was the SOCOM commander. And so the idea was, look, if we thought a program sucked, even if it was a Navy SEAL program or, the Air Force guy in charge of the AFSOC programs, he would go to the general and say, this is a bad program, you need to kill it. Or if it was the general's favorite program, you could still go to the general and say, sir, I know it's your favorite program, we need to kill it, it's not going to work. So the idea is, yes, you have to have a group of people that will, again, speak truth to power, that will tell you when you're wrong, tell you when you're screwed up, and give you kind of the unvarnished advice. So that's the idea behind it.
Yeah. Do you feel like, I feel like we're really resistant to that these days, though, in a lot.
Of course.
Right? Without getting too, it just feels like we almost go the opposite direction.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And you do so at great risk to yourself as a leader.
Completely agree.
Yeah. If you have a bunch of yes men and women around you, and you're about to walk into a minefield and they're too afraid to tell you that, then, you're going to make bad decisions. I try to, and again, it's hard sometimes. The more senior you get, the more people are deferential to you. But every time I was in a leadership position, I would make sure that my staff or the people that were working for me understood, one, if you see me walking into a minefield, a proverbial minefield or something, you better stop me. And if I find out you knew I was about to do something stupid and you didn't tell me, you and I are going to have a conversation. So feel free to come tell the commander when I'm screwed up. Now, you also had a sergeant major and a command master chief, and you rely on them as well because they have a close relationship with you to say, hey, boss, this is not the right thing to do, or I think you're moving in the wrong direction. But if you get this council of colonels, it's always very helpful to have somebody that will, again, tell you the unvarnished truth.
Yeah. Think about that, though, in terms of a business. So just a regular organization somebody might have out there. Is that a thing where it's a hiring thing where you're trying to hire people that sort of are automatically like that, where it's culturally across the board? Or do you see it where within an organization you would actually want to pick a group of people from the various departments or whatever and form a little thing to just say, hey, I need you guys to always just keep us in check?
Yeah. I think you can do it both ways, Chris.
Okay.
So when I ran the University of Texas system, I had a fabulous staff that worked for me. You know, none of them in the military until I hired General Tony Kuklo. But initially, these were all MDs, PhDs, lawyers, terrific folks. And so if you think of them as, you know, coming from SOCOM, I had a terrific staff at SOCOM, generals and colonels and admirals. And that is your kind of standard chain of command. And yes, you're going to rely on your staff. But you also know that there's some people on your staff that may be afraid, or they're just not the type that speak up when they see something, you know, going south. So you do find this kind of informal group. So I talk about in the book, you know, every president, you know, had a kitchen cabinet or something along those lines that weren't necessarily people in the command structure, but they were people they trusted.
Yeah.
So at the University of Texas, every time I had a difficult decision to make, I would call, I had 5 people that I called, and I knew that they would tell me the truth. They would be honest with me. And at the end of the day, I still have to make the decision. So I had a formal staff, and then I had kind of an informal group that every time I had a dicey decision to make, I'd kind of call them in and say, okay, here's what I'm about to do. What do you think? And particularly when you're in a situation, as I was as the chancellor, with no experience in higher education, no experience in healthcare, I really had to rely on them, you know, to give me their best advice. So yeah, you always need somebody like that. Whether you're running a Starbucks or a Burger King, or whether you're running, you know, the Navy SEAL Foundation or the University of Texas, or, you know, you're the CEO of a Fortune 50 company. Yeah. You better have a group of people that will tell you the truth that you can call on quickly when you're making tough decisions.
I know. And I just think it empowers leadership. This idea, this notion of like, I'm just going to get a bunch of people that agree with me on everything. To me, that sort of undermines leadership. It's like, right? Because it's like, well, I'm still the boss. And of course I want all these differing opinions, and I still make the decision. And that like makes my decision that much better, I think, and stronger to consider all those opinions.
Yeah. You know, you think about it in combat though, Chris. I mean, I used to love to watch it, and particularly watching the Rangers, but you know, we all did it. I mean, the SEALs did it and the Green Berets did it, you know, but the Rangers kind of had a very formal process, which, you know, if they go out on a mission and, you know, you'd have the young Ranger captain or major who was running the mission, and you'd have the first sergeant, and they'd go out on a mission and everybody would do their job, and they'd come back from the mission, then they'd get in the, you know, in the B HUD or in the tent. And then they would kind of metaphorically kind of take the collar devices off. Mm-hmm. So the corporals and the sergeants had just as much say as the captains and the majors.
Yeah.
And again, this was the debrief.
Yes.
And I would sit in on some of those things, and I was like, whoa. I mean, that corporal's coming out of left field, because again, at the end of the day, they knew if they didn't get it right the next time, people were going to die. So let's be dead serious about the mistakes we made. And so there was a period of time, and again, I know the SEALs did it, nobody else did it, but it was fun to watch the Rangers, because you had these young kids who, you know, a lot of the Rangers, you know, all they've done is they've gone through, you know, basic Ranger school. They're not long tab Rangers just yet. So they're young infantry soldiers for the most part, and they've been taught, and they understand they're part of the Ranger culture. And so they're taught to, hey, you better speak up. You got a chance to, and then when it's over, it's like, okay, put your collar devices back on. You're back to being a private and a corporal and a sergeant. I'm back to being the captain and the major, and away we go. That is a very important process, the debrief process, to make sure you don't screw up the second time.
100%. We were literally just talking about this morning, this exact thing, where it's just that hot wash process, right? Do it immediately, do it as soon as you can, because it's fresh in everybody's mind. And to your point, it's like, lay it all out there. And I was just giving the example of I mean, obviously we try to carry these lessons into our personal lives and our professional lives, but like when I still coach soccer, and when the guys come off the field at halftime, I'm not the first one to speak. It's always, what do you guys think? What are you doing well? What are you doing not so well? Right? You guys tell me first. And I just think that that's such a critical thing.
But this is great leadership. You know, great leadership means you set the tone for the organization. You build a culture that's not afraid to speak up when they need to. Again, recognizing that once the decision is made, and I've emphasized this a number of times, certainly in the military, but I think it applies across any organization. If you have an opportunity to speak your piece, but once the decision is made, you got to kind of salute smartly and move out as an organization. Just because you don't agree doesn't mean that, I mean, everything you say has got to be taken as golden advice. You know, at the end of the day, the decision maker makes a decision, and everybody's got to get on board and move out.
100%. On the X is brought to you by Mechanix Wear. Mechanix Wear gloves are kind of the go-to glove, I think, for most people out there, whether it's working around the house or on the job or some kind of tactical setting. That's certainly been the case for me throughout my life. And they've made a whole bunch of improvements to the gloves that they have out there. So they've got the kind of original series here with the Velcro backing, Velcro close that most people can use in sort of everyday settings, very ubiquitous for various things that you might want to do. Then they've got these fast fit ones, which you essentially just slide on. There's a little loop there around the wrist where you can pull them on. And then they've got the Impact series, which has a reinforced backing to protect your knuckles. And then they've got this lock ring reinforcement around the thumb now, where there's a lot of wear and tear. There's a whole bunch of other improvements to these. And if you go to their website, they literally have a 5 to 7 minute video about each one of these sets of gloves and all the improvements they've made, from the material, reducing the seams, making them more reinforced, making them more moisture wicking. It's clear that they put a lot of care and attention into their gloves. And if you listen to the guy talk on the website, they really love gloves. And I think that that comes out in everything they do. When I'm going out to a hardware store and I'm looking for some gloves, I almost look at everything else as just kind of a cheap knockoff. So definitely my go-to glove, highly recommended. Mechanicswear gloves, they're available at most retailers on mechanicswear.com and GSA Advantage, and they're proud to offer an exclusive 15% off discount through the ID.me program to military veterans and first responders. So check them out. So next one here, this is great. Bad news doesn't get better with age. This is like a tried and true adage of the SEAL teams and probably beyond too. This may be military wide, but what are we talking about here for people that aren't familiar?
Yeah, well, to your point, I mean, we all know, and this is, I think I had a Colin Powell one about bad news isn't like wine. It doesn't get better with age. I mean, we all know this. Like it's the longer you wait to let your boss know that things have gone south, the worse it's going to be for you.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I tell the story of when I first got back to Iraq. I mean, I think I'd taken over JSOC, and it was within a week or 2 weeks. I'm back in Iraq, and it's the first night I'm in, and I've just gone down after a long night. I've been traveling all day. I get back. Unfortunately, by this time it's 2008. We got the chews, the whatever we call them, the little housing units, and I have hardly shut my eyes. There's a pounding on the door, and a great officer, Sean Corrigan, is there, and he tells me about this incident, and it's a pretty egregious incident. I'm like, oh God, and so it's like, well, I know what I got to do. I got to call General Petraeus. I got to wake him up, and it's 2:00 in the morning, local time or whatever, and it because one, I had experienced this time and time again. The sooner you get ahead of it, the better you're going to be. And of course, I have to wake up Petraeus in the middle of the night, sort of thing, explain to him what's going on. And it's not good. And he's got to call the ambassador but I remember years later, and I had worked for Petraeus before, but not this closely. I mean, now I'm one of his commanders. He is the commander of the forces he's the MNFI commander in Iraq, and I'm the JSOC commander. And so now I am actually working for him. And I remember him years later saying, I didn't know how our relationship was going to work out, but when you called me that night and gave me the bad news, and it was, about as bad as it could have gotten, I knew you'd be okay. And I knew we were going to have a good relationship because you weren't afraid to give me bad news. And again, I had watched Stan McChrystal do this. I'd watched great leaders do this, for most of my career. Things don't get better with time. Had we waited until the morning, had I said, well, you know what, I'll wait until the sun comes up before I call General Petraeus, the problem is the news would have already spread, and it would have been out of control by the time I got to him, 6 hours later, 5 hours later, whatever. You got to move quickly when bad news happens so that you can begin to get ahead of it.
Yeah, for sure. Again, this is another one where I just think of parenting. This is something I try to teach to my kids of just like, hey, if something happens, like, tell me up front, because eventually I'm going to find out. And like, things are going to be a lot worse if I find out much later and you try to cover it up or something like that. Is this though, the other story you have in here is about Ollie North and the Iran-Contras. And it's sort of where you're talking about kind of the administration, like Reagan comes out and says this thing, and it's like, well, a couple months later or a couple of weeks later, it's like, well, it's not exactly true. And it's not exactly true. And it's sort of your whole point in there is it it degraded his, his likability and his favorability with the American people, because it was just like, just come out and say the true thing up front. Are we in danger with this though? Because now it's harder to grasp in a lot of cases what the truth is, right? Like when we say the truth comes out, sometimes it's like there's versions of that people just latch onto, and they're like, yeah, but no, that's not right. Or like you have opposing views of what's real.
Yeah, I think the difference here is the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's always going to be the conspiracy theorists out there and those that will twist the truth. But for, going back to them, for your viewers who might be younger and don't remember this, Reagan, who at the time before the Iran-Contra, his favorability rating in the polls was 63%.
Yeah.
That's very, very high.
Yes, it is.
Within 18 months, it had dropped down to the mid-40s because he didn't come forward and tell the truth. And of course, the truth came out. And my point is, and I think everybody agreed, had he come out right up front and said, look, yes, I traded, guns for hostages, and here's why I did this, I think the American people would have forgiven him and he would have moved on. Instead, he was afraid of the story. He was afraid of, his kind of relationship with Ollie North and how all this, that he hoped it wouldn't come out. The truth always comes out. Now, you talk about somebody's truth is this and somebody's truth is this. My point as a leader is, what the truth is.
Mm-hmm.
If you screwed up. What your role was in something that went south. So don't let other people define how you played this out. This is, again, why you've got to get out in front of these things. You come forward and say, here's what I did. Here's the time I did it on. I screwed up. Now, here's what we're going to do to fix it. Here's how I'm going to hold myself and others accountable. Because sooner or later, if you don't hold yourself accountable and if you don't come forward with the truth is going to come forward and other people are going to hold you accountable in a way that may not be, beneficial to you.
Right. So then that leads right into this next one, which is weaponize the truth, which is go on the offensive about this.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Yeah. I talk about I think in that when I talk about the McCain and the Fitzgerald.
Yeah.
And and here were, two horrible incidents, in the history of the Navy. And the chief of naval operations, John Richardson at the time, when this happens, he steps in front of the public and he goes through and says, we failed here, 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 we failed. He just lists the whole, doesn't sugarcoat anything and says, now let me tell you what we're going to do. We're going to do this and this and this. And as horrible as and again, the crews of these ships, did everything they could to take care of their fellow sailors when these collisions happened. But there was no way that the CNO was going to be able to soft sell this. And he understood that. He's a great leader. He stands in front of the American public and the world. And in fact, he also contacted all of his fellow naval officers, senior naval officers, and international naval officers and said, look, here's what we found out. Here's where we messed up. And really kind of laid his soul bare, laid the Navy's soul bare. And you know what? We moved past that pretty quickly, but we also learned a lot of lessons about how the ships were designed, how the crews were trained, because again, we faced it head on.
Yeah. How do we get back to that a little more? Just like societally, I just feel like again, this isn't my intention here is not to devolve into a political conversation or anything, but just this idea of no, the better thing is just deny, deflect, blame, right? Instead of like just come right out and say it, because I completely agree with you. I have so much more respect for anybody, but certainly leaders who just come out and say, hey, this is on me. I screwed this up. Here's what we're going to change moving forward. Right. Like to me, that's so much the better approach.
Yeah. I think part of this, Chris, is, these are the sort of things we've got to teach at the Naval Academy, at the University of Texas. Our job as leaders is to raise the next generation of leaders. And if you as a leader fail to, uphold these principles, if you as a leader deflect and deny and cast blame elsewhere, then other people are going to do it.
Yep.
And so I think our responsibility is certainly in the military, but, as parents, as guardians, as friends, whatever the relationship happens to be with the people around you, if you do the best you can to uphold these principles, then people around you, they're going to learn from you. They're going to see this as the right way to do business. And certainly in the military and in any organization, you follow these principles, and then the next generation says, you know what, I like the way that person led. That's what I want to be when I become a leader.
Yeah. Yeah. And you have this personal story in there too, of where we're getting basically some bad press in Afghanistan, and you just brought him in. You're like, hey, come on in. So, and it's funny, like the stuff you're describing in there, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember this stuff. So then moving all your options forward and just pausing on this real quick before I kind of ask a question. So you have this story in here with Churchill and the Tirpitz, which is this sort of like, indestructible kind of ship here in World War II, 1943. I'm reading this story and it's like, and I'm just thinking, I'm like, I know this story. I've heard this story before. And you mentioned your very first book, your master's thesis, right, from NPS, the Theory of Special Operations. And I'm like, I think this story is in that book, because we had to, so that book was, I had to look this up, but that book was published. It's not even listed in like the back flap of this one, as one of your books, right? But I had to look it up. That book was published in 1996. And I was a senior at, a firstie at the Naval Academy in 1997. And it was our capstone book. So we had like, the group of guys that were all going to go spec war with Dick Hoffman as our instructor. Oh, yeah. And that was the book we were assigned. So we read it. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, I think this story is in that. I mean, this was almost 30 years ago. And I looked it up. I'm like, I'm right. It was in that book, right? Like this was one of the things you talked about in that book as well.
It is. The interesting thing about it is a little tidbit for your listeners here. So I originally had an entirely different story in that book.
Oh, okay.
And what happened was I have to put all of my books have got to go through the Department of Defense security review process. Yep. And normally, and I've done this even for Make Your Bed, I had to go through. So I sent it to these guys, and I've been working with these guys for, 6-7 years now. And normally they come back and there's some happy to glad changes. Now, again, they send them to all the agencies, SOCOM reviews them, CENTCOM, all the combatant commanders. And it's a long process. So it comes back and I'm looking at it like, oh yeah, okay, change this. And then all of a sudden I get this entire like 10 blacked out pages. So I called the guy up and I said, hey, I'm missing something here. What's going on? And he kind of sheepishly said, yeah, you're going to have to take that whole story out. I'm like, what? I said, this is getting ready to go to press here. And he goes, I'm sorry. So I had to come up with another story. And I did so because I had written this story, to your point, Chris, in my thesis, my Naval Postgraduate School thesis. And I remembered deeply the story. Of course, I had pulled it from my book here, and I went back because the idea on the Tirpitz was about, there were multiple options to go after the Tirpitz. There was an air, there was a bombing campaign, there was a X-craft campaign, there was a, hit the dry dock campaign. All of these were so that the Tirpitz, this behemoth battleship, much like the Bismarck, wouldn't come out and threaten the Royal Navy. And Churchill very much understood that, hey, we can't just take, one shot at this. Yeah. We've got to apply every different option we have to try and solve this problem.
Yeah. Do you ever, by the way, when you read those stories, are you ever just amazed by the bravery of some of these people? I'm just always blown away. Like when I read Ben Milligan's book and interviewed him, some of these guys in World War II, they're just like, the stories are just incredible. These guys in this one particularly, right? They like, A-team style kind of reinforce a ship to your point, to ram a dry dock. Like we're just going to ram it and then we're going to run up on shore and we're going to try to, attack targets in the hinterland here. And then you got these like mini sub things where it's like, probably not a tried and true technology or anything. A couple of them just sink behind the things that are towing them in. It's just extraordinary to me, the bravery.
Yeah, here's what I'll tell you, Chris, is, 50 years from now, the young kids coming through BUDS or those out in the military, they're going to read stories about the guys that fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're going to say the same thing.
True.
They're going to say the exact same thing about the courage and the commitment and the bravery. They'll be awed by some of the missions that you guys did day in and day out, and they'll begin to wonder whether or not some of those missions were real because the courage was so incredible. So yeah, and of course I had a chance in my master's thesis to interview a lot of these guys, and they weren't 10 feet tall. They were regular people trying to do the best they could, and yeah, damn right they were brave.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure, I would have had the courage to do what a lot of them were doing, but this was a world war, and this was an existential threat to them, and they were prepared to do whatever it took to save England in this case.
Yeah, it just strikes me as, I think sometimes we think that these like really heroic actions, level of valor, just above and beyond, or limited just to sort of specific Medal of Honor citations. And the reality is it's across the board. It's across the board. It's inspiring, right? It's amazing stuff. So we already talked about kind of second law of thermodynamics. Anything else on that? Just like this idea of like chaos is going to ensue, and the quicker you get in front of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the bottom line to this is, the crisis they don't go away. They don't go away on their own. So the point is figure out how you're going to contain it as quickly as you can.
Right. So then don't rush to failure. This one I think is really interesting. You talk about Eagle, like, Desert One, and you talk about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, but this is really interesting because it's sort of, you could take the opposite approach. You hear this in small business a lot with startups of like fail fast, fail often, right?
Sure.
And that is kind of a tried and true thing. So how do you kind of square that corner between those two things where, we don't want to rush to failure, but a lot of times, like, is it a consequence thing, right? Is it like how much is riding on this? Is that where you kind of draw the line?
I think, when you think of fail fast, and I spent a lot of time with the people of Silicon Valley that value this idea of failing fast, but it's software. This is, hey, we're going to put out a piece of software. We're going to put out a small piece of hardware. If it doesn't work, then we try something else. So Google, actually on the corporate jet on Google, it's got, X10, fail fast, 10 times, and then we'll move on.
Right.
Right.
Yep.
But that doesn't work real well when you're talking about lives that hang in the balance.
Sure.
So I think this is where, the point I was trying to make is, again, you've got to kind of balance this. This is the challenge for a lot of leaders is, in some cases, you have to move quickly. And, but then you also have to be smart enough not to get out ahead of your skis, sort of saying. And this is where experience comes into play. Those people that have been at this for a long time know how fast they can move before things start to, the wheels start to come off the bus. And so this is the challenge for a lot of, particularly when war, if you're starting off on a war. I mean, I remember the early days of Iraq and Afghanistan, and we got a lot of things wrong. But boy, by the time we had spent years over there, the experience allowed us to have a much better appreciation for how to move quickly without putting the force at risk. So you see, I talk about Desert One and my conversation with Dick Meadows, and he was incredibly heroic. And of course, he also was highly, highly respectful of Charlie Beckwith, and rightfully so. But he just felt that they moved a little fast during the rehearsal, and this is probably what caused them some of the problems in the conduct of the mission. But you have to remember and put it in context. That was the first kind of soft mission that had been conducted in a long time, right? So it's not like Iraq and Afghanistan where we're going out every night. We're failing maybe fast, but we're learning. I mean, they had been, a lot of these guys were Vietnam vets, of course, but it had been a while since Vietnam. Now, all of a sudden, this opportunity to go rescue the hostages takes place. But it was not an everyday affair for them. So there's some things that, of course, we've all learned. We've been recipients on the good end of the failures that they had for Eagle Claw. That's what's made us better. But we still tend to, at times, sometimes rush to failure, and we got to be careful about doing that.
Yeah. Do you have like a decision matrix you run through in your head on this? Because this is one of these where you can take a couple of these principles and you put them together, and there's sort of a fine line you got to walk in between all of them, right? So it's like first reports are always wrong, so you got to be a little bit measured at the beginning. But you got to act in some circumstances. It's a crisis, so you got to get something done, but you got to get enough information, but you don't want to rush to failure. So there's that kind of push-pull there of figuring out and getting back to just, again, I had this conversation this morning about this where I was basically saying, one of the leadership qualities I really like about leaders is they make decisions, right? Where they're not just constantly like, give me more information. Like that's one of the things I can't stand about leaders that aren't good leaders is they just don't make decisions. Like make a decision, even if it ends up being wrong, it'll be a poor plan, but we'll perfectly execute it instead of waiting for this perfect plan. So is there like a calculus that you have on that where you're where you sort of like figure out how to thread that needle, so to speak?
Yeah, there is. Now, some of this is, again, based on experience. So, at one point in time, as we were preparing for the bin Laden raid, I think Secretary Hillary Clinton was asking me about, how many times had we done helicopter raids, and how many times have we done this? And, in my head, I just quickly said, man, we've done this thousands of times. And I was, oh my gosh, am I right? Have we done this thousands of times? Of course, I went back and I began to actually do the calculation. I realized just in my career alone, I had probably done close to 10,000 missions. And by that, I meant I either commanded them, I went on them, or as the commander, I touched the concept of operations. I had a chance. Somebody would bring me the ConFs. I'd go, yeah, okay, got it. Let's move out. So this idea that, you have that level of experience. And so sometimes that level of experience just puts you in a position where you see things and intuitively you say, we're moving too fast, we're moving too slow, that sort of thing. But there is a calculation to it. And my effort was always to try to simplify a mission as much as I could. And so the risk to me was always when the mission got complicated, when I saw too many moving parts, that's when I said time out. So when somebody brought me a concept of operations and they said, okay, sir, we got 5, 47s, got a couple of Blackhawks. We're going to move into this compound. We're going to do this. I've got, 50 Rangers, a bunch of SEALs, Green Berets, Delta guys. We're going to do it. Whoa, time out. Explain to me why we're doing this again. How can we reduce this and simplify this so that, one, we understand the risk and we can manage the risk? If you go back to my master's thesis, that's what a lot of this was about. It was reducing the risk to a manageable level.
Yeah.
There's always going to be risk, but the thing that you always try to do is you want to simplify the mission. You want to, again, rehearse it as much as you can, and then you've got to rely on the skill and the quality of the guys to get the job done. But if you make a mission too complicated, then it increases the risk factor, and then it increases the chance that it's going to fail. So for me, it was always about understanding the nature of the risk. So, is there a formula in my head? A lot of times there's the if, and then formula. If I see this and I know this, then I'm in a position to move, right? So I tended to think of things, missions, as an if, and then. And we ended up using that to brief the president. So I would tell the president, if we had a mission, let's say off the coast of Somalia or into Yemen or something, and we were going after bad guy X, I would say, okay, Mr. President, if we have, an 8-digit grid on bad guy X, and we know that there's not going to be any civilian casualties, then you're going to give me permission to strike, or whatever happens to be. If the bad guy is on this road and we know that, the percentage of civilian casualties could be low, then you give me permission to strike. And so this really would put me in a position to make the decisions quickly, right? And it also put the president in a position to say there were some checks and balances. So the president understood that I was never going to take a strike because sometimes I couldn't come back to the president. It's one of these things, the intel is hit.
Yep.
I've got a matter of minutes to make a decision. You can't pull together the National Security Council. You've got to make a decision. But I already had in place the criteria for making the decision, right? So there's a lot of little tools that I would use. A lot of it relied on my postgraduate school thesis. A lot of it was just on my experience over, a long time in the teams.
Yeah. So speaking of getting the information from people, micromanagement is not an ugly word, which this is the one I read and I went, ooh, some people are going to push back on that, right? Just go, hey, do you want me to micromanage you? I think most people go, no, not at all. I don't want that. So, but you're sort of redefining this a little bit. What are we talking about?
Well, so this goes back to when I was the ops officer at SDV Team 2, which was on the East Coast at the time. And my commanding officer was a guy named Bob Mabry, Commander Bob Mabry. Yeah. And Bob had been a prior enlisted guy, terrific commanding officer. And so I am the new ops officer. I had been in SDVs as a young ensign, but hadn't been in them a while. And so one of the platoons is getting ready to go out on one of the training missions, and I'm supposed to come in and brief Mabry on this. And so I go in to brief him, and I thought I was very clever. So this was 1986, I think, somewhere around there.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, the word micromanagement was new in the business vernacular.
Yeah.
Your point, it was a derogatory term. It meant that you were over-controlling your employees. So, and I'd read it in some Harvard Business Review or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I come in and Mabry starts asking me these questions about the platoon. Well, what's platoon's E&E plan? What's platoon doing here? How's platoon going to approach this? And of course, I didn't have the answer to a lot of those questions. So I decide, I'm going to impress the boss now. So I said, well, sir, I didn't want to be micromanaging the platoon. And he jumps down my throat. And I'd known him for a long time. He goes, okay, Bill, let me tell you something. I expect you to micromanage the platoon until they know what your expectations are. And then once they know your expectations, then you can begin to release the reins a little bit. Because if they don't know what you expect, then don't be surprised if they don't meet your expectations. And so this was very important to me. And again, in 9/11, when I had the after 9/11, when I had the opportunity to look at concept of operations, I had to make sure whether they were the SEALs, the Rangers, Delta, you name it. I would say, look, here's my expectations. I expect you to do this. This is the ROE. This is the law of armed conflict. This is how you're going to, and be very, very specific up front. Because if you're not, then don't be surprised if they get off the reservation. If you haven't told them exactly what your expectations are, right?
Yeah.
Once you do that, and you've defined the bright red lines, then you let them operate freely in between those lines, right? You got to give them the latitude to do the job. But I also go back, I think it was The Wisdom of the Bullfrog. I talked about Bucky Burris. So Bucky Burris was the guy that was the one of the ground commanders for the Sante raid.
Oh, okay.
Yep. They wasn't Bucky Burris. But at one point in time, he is working with the DOE on transporting nuclear materials. And he comes up to, he's been watching this for days, and he comes up to the police commander who's running this training exercise, moving, nuclear material across the country. And he asks the guy, he says, hey, I noticed that you haven't taken the time to inspect your troopers. And the police lieutenant turns to him and says, well, sir, we're all professionals. We don't need an inspection. And his response was, well, a real professional would understand the value of an inspection.
Mm-hmm.
And so my point on that is, it's like anything else. If you don't, know what to expect, don't be surprised if they don't meet those expectations. Make those expectations clear, micromanage at the beginning, and then give them the latitude to do the job.
Yeah. Is there a specific
particularly in a crisis?
Is there a specific way to convey that? Like, again, I'm trying to pull this into sort of a business aspect, because I do think that this is something I think we do all struggle with this a little bit, where we're disconnected, we work remotely like I do, and potentially we sort of assume that other people know exactly what they should be doing or what we're thinking or what we want from them. And we just go, and then when they don't do it, you're like, why didn't they understand that? So I don't know. Is there like a method there? Is it like I write down these specific things for people or what?
Yeah. You put it in writing.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Which what people are reluctant to do a lot of times. But you think, I'll go back to the Rangers. I mean, you think of, Roger's rules for the Rangers,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the 10 lessons sort of thing. Every Ranger has that memorized, right? Every Ranger understands, what you're supposed to. And, we built a similar SEAL book to the Ranger handbook at one point in time and began to lay that out. And they were great. There was stuff from Vietnam and things that guys had learned. So the point is, as a manager, as a leader, if you say, again, here's what my expectations are for the platoon. You need to have a good E&E plan. You need to do this. You need to do an inspection before you go out. You want to make sure that, X, Y, and Z. And you lay that out and you lay that framework out and you say, here are my expectations. And then if something happens, they go, oh, sorry, sir, I forgot to inspect this before we left. You go, hey, didn't I tell you that's kind of one of the things I want you to do?
Yeah.
Now, does that sound a little controlling? My point about the crisis is, in a crisis, you have to be specific early on. Because if you're not, in the middle of a crisis where things are moving fast and you have expectations, don't be surprised if those expectations aren't met if you haven't, using the ugly word, micromanaged.
Right. Last couple here. So dictate the tempo. So how do you do that in a crisis? How do you dictate the tempo of a crisis?
Yeah, this is probably the hardest thing to do. I mean, I talk about some of our operations during Desert Storm where we had to board an Iraqi ship. And it is one of these things, and think of it, it's a sports metaphor, but think of it as momentum. You see it happen all the time. I'm a big basketball player, and I like to play basketball. And you watch, as you're watching the playoffs, you hear the announcer say, hey, the momentum is shifting, right?
Yeah.
Well, this is about dictating tempo, and you can feel it. You can feel it in the basketball game. You can feel it, frankly, you can feel it on a mission. You can feel when you're losing the momentum. when you are no longer dictating the tempo of the operation, when the crisis is overpowering you, right? So what you've got to do is you've got to find a way to change the dynamics of the crisis, and you've got to be in charge of it when you're shaping it. So I think this is the one where I talk about Scipio Africanus, right?
Yes, exactly. Yep. Yeah.
So this is the one. So for your listeners here, you've got Hannibal, the great general, has come across the Alps and he's coming into Rome, and the Romans have been beaten at every stop. And Hannibal is not far from coming into Rome, and a young general, 25-year-old general named Scipio Africanus says, "I can take care of this." And there's a whole lot of things that play into this. But instead of hitting Hannibal directly head on, he goes to Carthage and lays siege to Carthage, which was Hannibal's hometown, and changes the nature of the crisis. Hannibal's got to retreat to protect Carthage. That was the big move that he had to make so that he could shape, he could dictate the tempo, right?
Yep.
So you think about this in terms of, let's say you're the CEO and something has gone bad in your company. Once again, if you don't confront it head on, then the news, then everybody else is driving the tempo. The questions are coming at you. The news is coming at you. Your employees are coming at you. The way you dictate the tempo is you say, okay, here are the facts. Bang, 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 bang. We screwed up here. Bang, bang, bang. Here's what I'm doing. Bang, bang, bang. Now you've got the tempo. You're dictating the tempo by saying, the next thing I'm going to do is, let's take the Tylenol scare. So again, long before your listeners were probably even live, there were a number of Tylenol capsules that were poisoned.
Oh, yeah.
Now, it wasn't the fault. Yeah. And so this became a nationwide crisis because Tylenol was the biggest selling pharmaceutical on the market at the time, right? It was in every grocery store and every pharmacy around the country. And then all of a sudden, 6 or 7 people died from taking Tylenol. And clearly there was somebody going around that was poisoning the Tylenol capsules, right? So at the time, now all of a sudden, I can't remember the pharmaceutical firm, and I probably wouldn't say it on the side anyway. But the pharmaceutical firm says, you know what? We can say there's some crazy guys doing this, but we're getting all these questions. So the CEO said, you know what? This is on us. I got it. We're going to take all the Tylenol off the shelf. And of course, the shareholders said, are you out of your mind? This is the biggest revenue generator in this company. And he said, I understand that. He said, they said, your share prices will drop dramatically. I got that. But if we don't do that, then I don't dictate the tempo, right? And this lunatic could continue to poison Tylenol. So he does. He takes all the Tylenol off the shelves. He begins to build. So now if you wonder why it's such a pain in the ass for all your capsules, for all these, and the sealable tops and all that, that's from the Tylenol share, right? He does that, and sure enough, the stock tanks. And then all of a sudden, customers, clients, the American people had tremendous faith in what this company was doing. The stock turned around, shot up. He became the CEO of the century and was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom because he took the crisis head on. He shaped the narrative. He said, this is on me. Here's what we're going to do. And so this is sometimes what you have to do to begin to shape and to dictate the tempo. Attack it head on. You drive the crisis. You drive the tempo of the crisis after you've, again, contained it a little bit.
That's a great story. I didn't know that story. I think I remember. When did that Tylenol scare happen? Was it?
Oh, this was in the 70s.
Oh, okay. Maybe I'm thinking of something different. But by the way, just to tie it to pop culture, that battle you're talking about is the Battle of Zama. That is the one that's in Gladiator. That is the first, like when they go to the Colosseum, right? And they that's what they're reenacting there, where they do it in reverse, where he's like, hey, weren't they supposed to lose this battle? And he's like, yeah, I'm sorry, but that's the battle. I know you only got a few minutes here. So the last one on here, always time for morale check, which I think is kind of like, hey, always good idea to see how everyone's doing, right?
Yeah, I think it's there's kind of 2 points of that. Of course, I tell a story about, me getting kind of kicked in the in the belly for a decision I made when I was a chancellor.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, I had a great Army officer that was part of my staff, General Tony Kukalo. Tony had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, a great Army general. And so, I had to go stand before the press and tell everybody in the state of Texas that I'd screwed up. And I got, there was national news, or obviously all the local newspapers, the man that got bin Laden is failing as chancellor, this sort of thing, And so it was a bad day. But, again, You got to stand up. You got to say, okay, I made some mistakes. Here's what we're going to, well, of course, nobody was shooting at me, so I was like, this will be fine. I'll figure out how to get through this. But I realized that my staff, I had a great relationship with my staff. And again, and I say my staff, not just my small staff, but the University of Texas system. We had about 900 people at the time. And so I go into my office after this press conference, and before long, there's a banging on the door, and it's Tony Kuklo, and he throws the door open, he yells, "Morale check!" Right. And of course, then he starts harassing me unmercifully. Wow, you really got the shit kicked out of you there.
Yes.
As any good soldier would do.
Friend, yes, would do. Sure.
And then he kind of makes the subtle hint about, hey, boss, the employees could use a little morale boost as well. And then, and again, you understand this, Chris. This is what you have to do. You got to walk around. You got to have a cup of coffee. You got to let people see that, hey, your shoulders are back, your head's up, your eyes are clear. You got this. You're going to be fine. The organization is going to be fine. Because if you fail to do that, if you fail to maintain the morale of the rank and file, then when you need them in a crisis, they're not going to be at their best. So it's not just about your morale. It's about the people that work for you, their morale, so that, again, the organization can continue to flourish.
Yeah. Do you have time for another couple questions? 1, 2?
Yeah, I think so. Go ahead.
Cool. So just some other stuff. So first of all, did you ever think that make your bed would strike such a chord with people?
No, never. This was the interesting thing on that speech is I had written an entirely different speech. I was a SOCOM commander. I had a day job, but I write all my own stuff. So I had been kind of toying away on a speech, and the Wednesday before the Saturday that I was supposed to give the speech, I realized it didn't work. And I went into my wife, and I was a little bit of a panic. And I said, "Oh my God, this speech doesn't work." And she's the one that told me, "Well, why don't you write about something you know?" And well, that's a clever idea. I said, "Look, the only thing I know is how to be a SEAL." And she said, "Well, write about that." I thought, I don't know. I'm about to go stand in front of 30,000 students and their parents in uniform. Do they really they want me to tell them about being a Navy SEAL? And then I started thinking about Bud's training. I thought, well, this is really life kind of crammed into 6 months. So I used the idea of Bud's training and kind of the 10 lessons I learned from Bud's. But of course, the first one I knew it was a little bit chronological. As you recall, in first phase, I don't know if they did it but when I went through in first phase, we always had an inspection.
Yep.
And
me too.
We always had to make our bed, right?
Yep.
Had to make our bed. And so, I knew when I wrote it that there was a certain level of kind of cleverness to it. And that it seemed, this is kind of inconsequential, but no, it's actually very consequential, because if you get up and you start your day and you take a little pride in something small, it's going to inspire you to do another task and another. And also it's about the little things. If you can't do the little things right, now you're going to do the big things right.
Yeah.
But after I gave the speech, again, this was 2014. Yeah, I've been overseas for most of my, last 14 years or whatever. And I remember as I'm leaving, I had my security detail that was with me, a great bunch of soldiers and Marines. And one of the guys comes up to me and goes, "Hey, sir, your speech is going viral." Well, that didn't sound very good. I said, "Oh, what does that mean?" He goes, No, that's a good thing. I said, "Really?"
Yeah.
He goes, "Yeah, it's," and, but today I see people every single day in the airport. I get emails, I get letters. They have no idea I was even in the military.
Oh, wow.
No, they don't know anything about my career. All they know is that I told them to make their bed, and I'm okay with that. If that ends up being my legacy, so be it.
No, it's great. I mean, to me, it's a how you do anything is how you do everything, which is one of my favorite things.
No,
right? That's what it is. So just last thing here, just on kind of leadership in general. I mean, obviously, someone who has so much experience in this, I sort of touched on it before, but I feel like in a lot of ways, some of these sort of tried and true leadership principles, we're in various places we're failing, I think. And to your point, I don't know, it comes down to us as individuals, right? I once heard that as a parent, just going back to something that a lot of people will share as well, your kids don't really pay attention to what you say. They pay attention to what you do. They watch what you do, and that's what makes a difference. Yeah. So to that point, it's incumbent upon us as leaders to not worry about necessarily how other people are leading, but how we are leading as individuals. And so
Yep.
what is the one thing that we should do better, or that we should really focus on to make ourselves the best leaders?
Well, one, I think I couldn't have said it better, Chris. I mean, at the end of the day, it really is up to us as leaders to kind of show the next generation leaders, what right looks like. But the fundamentals of leadership come down to character and integrity.
Mm-hmm.
I told the story, I think it was in the Wisdom of the Bullfrog. I talk about the long green table, and again, it was one of my early, when I was an ensign at UDT 11, and I had to go brief the boss, and he talked about, well, if you make these decisions and take these actions, will you be able to stand before the long green table? Well, back in 1978, we didn't have Google, so I had to go look it up. But in every Navy conference room, there was a table that was covered in a thin film of green felt. And whenever there was some sort of official proceeding, the young officer would go in, there would be, guys sitting around the long green table. And the implication was, hey, if you can't make your case, why you made these decisions, why you took these actions to reasonable men and women sitting around the table, then maybe you should rethink those. But then he told the most important part. He said, look, if you want to always be on the right side of history, you just need to do three things. Make sure all your decisions and all your actions are moral, legal, and ethical. Moral, legal, and ethical. Ethical, follow the rules. Legal, follow the law. Moral, follow what you know to be right. If you do that, you're always going to be on the right side of history. And I think, you follow those as a leader, then the generational leaders that come behind us, they're going to be okay.
Yeah. Well, perfect. We'll end there, sir. Thank you so much. It's always great to see you.
It's good seeing you.
And thanks again for supporting us at the foundation, everything we do. Sorry, we'll miss you in Houston tonight, but thanks again for recording the kind of video intro. The book, Conquering Crisis, really enjoyed it. Thanks again for sending it to me. And until next time, sir, really appreciate it.
All right, Chris, you take care of yourself. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to On the X, the official podcast of the Navy SEAL Foundation and an Ironclad original series sponsored by Mechanix. Learn more at NavySealFoundation.org or text On the X to 60104. See you next time.